Hi, I'm Amanda,
And I'm Kara.
and welcome to the Historical Society podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Because this coming Tuesday is going to be election day, we wanted to focus our attention on women's suffrage because we all have the right to vote now. But how do we get there? We all know that until 1920, women in this country did not have the freedom to vote. And so we're going to focus in on that. And as I was researching this, I was curious about the world. What about other countries around the world? When did women get the right to vote there? And I found an article from the Pew Research Center's website. It's written by Catherine Schaefer, entitled Key Facts About Women's Suffrage Around the World, a Century After the U.S. Ratified the 19th Amendment, written on October 5th, 2020. I'm not going to read from it, but basically I found out that 25 countries were granted the right to vote before the United States. I kind of found that interesting because I always thought the U.S. kind of led the way, but that's not really the case. The first country was New Zealand in 1893. And then we see Australia, 1902, Finland, 1906, and then you have all the countries until you get to the United States. And then the same article, she also talks about how despite having the right to vote, it did not guarantee that everybody had the right to vote. So women would be granted the right to vote, but usually they would be, certain women would be barred from voting because of things like their race, their age, their educational level, or their marital status. And in this country, basically it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that black women were actually federally permitted and protected to vote. And it was the same for black men. So in this country, black men did gain the right to vote before 1920. But even then, it was a massive struggle for them to exercise that freedom. And so while I was researching for this episode, I came across a story from 1920 that will highlight that very reality for black men. And I wanted to focus on it because everything okay?
Drop my phone.
Sorry. It sounded like the mic kind of bit the dust, but it was just your phone. Okay, cool. That's cool.
It's my phone.
We're all okay. Everything's okay.
We're okay.
Yeah. So this story, I'm just going to start telling this story. It starts November 2nd, 1920, and that's actually election day of that year. A white mob terrorized the black citizens of Ocoee.
Ocoee.
Yeah, Ocoee. We just looked this up, and I still said it wrong. Ocoee,
That's
Florida.
Okay.
In the violent terror campaign, dozens of black people died, and the black community was destroyed in that town. It all started when a black man dared to try to vote, to exercise his right to vote.
So it was already officially legal,
It was
correct?
already legal. It had been legal for quite a long time because that amendment had already been passed. So Mr. Mose Norman, along with other black men, went to the polls to vote, but were turned away for a bogus poll tax reason. Mr. Norman, after seeking advice from Judge John Chaney, returned to try again to vote that same day. However, this time, armed white men waiting at the polling station immediately assaulted him. Mr. Norman was able to escape and run to his friend and business associate's home, Mr. Julius Perry. Word spread of Mr. Norman trying to vote, and the white mob descended on Mr. Perry's home. Seeking to capture both of the men, they burned Mr. Perry's home and severely injured him. Mr. Norman was able to escape, but Mr. Perry was taken to jail. The white mob went to the jail the next day and took Mr. Perry from the jail, beat him, hung him from a tree, and shot his body multiple times. Over the next 2-day span, dozens of black people were killed, 25 black homes and 2 black churches were burned. The election day, the Ocoee, okay, it's called, this is the actual title. I want to try to get the town name right. The Ocoee Election Day Massacre is one of the bloodiest days in American political history. The surviving black residents of the town fled, leaving behind their personally owned homes, land, and private property. And again, the reason I wanted to highlight this is because, in my opinion, it's impossible to talk about sexism, which is kind of the focus of our talk, women's suffrage, without talking about racism as well. Sexism, I'm just going to give a little definition, is a word that we usually use to describe the treatment of women as subservient, inferior, less than, not equal to men. And sexism is why women were denied the right to vote. Then we have racism. Racism is why Black Americans were denied the right to vote. And we also have to think about slavery, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, and from there you really have a clear picture of racism. And these two isms, like I've said, I probably have said this before on this podcast, these two isms are cut from the same cloth, and they leave people abused, disenfranchised, violated, and in some case, murdered. This real story also drives home that even when people are granted a right in the U.S., it doesn't mean that U.S. citizens will honor that right. And I came up with this sentence, unless somebody else wrote it, which is always possible. If it's a struggle to get a right, it will be a struggle to exercise that right. And that's what we've seen throughout our history in the United States. I also wanted to go back in my notes here. There was a little fact that I wanted to share, and it's something that I wasn't fully aware of. And I always have to think a little bit about the education system in the U.S. and how, especially now, we see people want to make it impossible for teachers to teach real American history, to discuss racism, to discuss the actual events of our history. And so, it's possible that when I was growing up, I wasn't paying attention in class. That is very possible. But I kind of feel like we didn't spend a ton of time on, these really deep and dark things that are that really shaped the fabric of our society today. We kind of like glossed over them and moved on. But with lynchings, I want to say there were over 4,700 in the U.S. between a big chunk of time frame there. The last one before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was that of Emmett Till in 1955. And then, and this, I didn't know this, but in 1981, so I was born in 1982, 1 year before I was born, Michael Donald was lynched by the KKK in Mobile, Alabama. So that really puts up, it kind of pushes what we think of happening much earlier right up close to in our generation. It sits right there. And so I think sometimes because we've had a different lived experience somehow, like we're not in the 50s, that we were like, oh, that's over. But then we don't realize, wait, all of that stuff has influenced where we're at today. It's influenced our government, our economy, our everything. Everything's been influenced by these events.
Our grandparents, our parents, our us, in turn.
Everything is right there.
Oh, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce escape?
Escape. What did I say?
Okay. It sounds like you're saying escape.
Nuh-uh.
But I could be wrong because sometimes you just pronounce things differently.
Well, sometimes my tongue doesn't want to cooperate with me, basically. I've actually wondered if I have a little bit of a speech impediment. Like if I need...
Really?
Yeah, I've thought about listening back to our podcast and pinpointing the syllables I struggle with. Well, if they're the same ones.
I think it's the way you're pronouncing. Yeah, because I don't think you actually say it that way. But I was just curious.
Yeah. No, I say escape, not escape. I probably say other words incorrectly, but that one, I think I've got.
That's awesome.
Okay.
I thought so.
I thought row. Okay, this is interesting. My colleague in the symphony told me that. So when I was driving on 64, it's a interstate that goes through St. Louis. The other day I saw that it looked like some women had put up a big sign on this bridge that goes across the highway, row your vote, ROE your vote, to tell people that, because there's an amendment, an abortion amendment on the ballot this year in Missouri. And my colleague told me that some woman came up and destroyed it, and the police were looking for her. So,
whoa.
Yeah. Nuts.
Dang.
Yeah. So, controversy. All right. So, now we're going to begin our exploration of going from the 1700s through up until the 1920s. So, we have an idea of what happened and how did women end up getting the right to vote. Sound good?
Yep. Yeah. And actually, we're going to talk about Abigail Adams and her husband, right?
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little, Kara?
This actually pissed me off the way he responded to her. Mm-hmm. It did.
How about you?
Okay.
You start going. You start talking.
Okay. So Abigail Adams, in a letter to her husband, March 1776, while he was in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, she wrote him the following. Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Okay, so that was her letter to him. And then he replies, I cannot but laugh. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. And as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, most numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know that they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know, we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat.
Isn't that crazy? So he's saying,
WTF.
Yeah. So he's basically saying,
That's
like,
the wife he's talking to.
I know
Do you want me to say really quickly what she writes back first?
Yeah, go ahead.
She writes back and says, but you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken, and notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet.
Go, Abigail Adams. She wrote that in May 7th, May 7th, 1776.
No. She wrote that last week.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
She wrote that 2020. Wait, no. Okay, so we're going to keep going with women from that time frame. So I'm going
to start saying that to you. I cannot but laugh at your request.
Thank you.
We will not be subject to the petticoats.
That's pretty good.
Despotism of the petticoat.
Despotism of the petticoats. Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Wow, it's something, right? And yeah, there's just so much you could say. There's so much in there that we could dig into, but we'll keep going. Okay, so I wanted to highlight other women from this exact time frame who are also of the same opinion as Abigail Adams. So this is Judith Sargent Murray, and she wrote I believe a book or a treatise or a novel or something called On the Equality of the Sexes in 1790. And she writes, are we deficient in reason? We can only reason from what we know. And if opportunity of acquiring knowledge hath been denied us, the inferiority of our sex cannot fairly be deduced from thence. Right? So she's like, well, educate us. If you think we're inferior, it's because you're oppressing us and suppressing us, and we can't get educated. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, Kara, you want to read about... So this other woman, her name is Mary Wollstonecraft. She's British, but she's going to be influencing American women as well. So would you like to read her quote?
She's quoted as saying, for I really think that women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed in the deliberations of government.
So she's advocating for the right to vote. And then the other quote of hers, this comes from her book, A Vindication on the Rights of Women, written in 1792. She wrote, I do not wish them, women, to have power over men, but over themselves. So she's not saying women should dominate men. She's just like, we should just be allowed to exist like men exist.
Sorry, I missed that one, but you're right. That's a good point, because we talk about that a lot. We don't wish to have power over them, but just...
Equal.
Yeah,
equal treatment. Yeah. Okay, so that was the 1700s. I found that really interesting that women were like, what about us from the very beginning? Yeah. Okay, and now we're going to kind of walk through starting around the 1830s. And my sourcing for this, there's a really great PBS documentary, It's about 20 minutes long, 21 minutes long. It's very helpful. I really use that to help me kind of go chronologically through the events. The documentary is called History in a Nutshell, Women's Suffrage Movement. And then the other sources, I use the National Women's History Museum website as well, and the Atlanta History Center's website. So this is where all my sourcing came from. From the beginning of the movement until the passage of the 19th Amendment, it took over 70 years for women to receive the right to vote. But of course, only some women. There were schisms within the movement, political opposition, and public backlash. All issues the movement had to combat in its quest for women's suffrage. I feel like I said one of those words wrong.
Schism?
Schism. Yeah, I was like, what did I say? What did I say?
You said schisms.
Schisms. Okay, that's not so bad.
I actually wondered if it's plural or singular.
It should. Oh, that's a good question. I would assume plural, but anyway.
Depending on what,
Because I wrote that.
how you phrase the sentence.
I feel like I wrote that incorrectly, so.
Okay, you corrected it. You corrected it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Some women became involved in the abolitionist movement and started to speak at events here and there. However, those women who spoke publicly during this time were usually mocked, as men believed women should not be speaking at all, nor should anyone care what women thought. However, over time, things began to change, and by the late 1830s, some men in the abolitionist movement also had come around.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
When women when women from the abolition movement became friends and began to discuss not just abolition but also women's rights, these women and also I wanted to say these women were strong supporters of the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. Two such women were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we talked really briefly about Elizabeth Cady Stanton in our episode 3, Politics and Women, or Women in Politics. I can't remember which word goes first. And I kind of sped through it really quickly because Kara was like, this is so boring. So she's very interesting, and I'll mention her name a couple times. She was very important in this movement. She was also controversial in many ways because of what happens along the way. Okay. These two women, they met in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, but they were denied entry into the convention. And so that really kind of pushed them over the edge and they wanted to be equal citizens to men. And so they Elizabeth Cady Stanton held a tea party at her house in July of 1848. And those two women plus several other women were there in attendance. And they decided they wanted to have a women's convention to discuss women's rights. And in the same month, July 1848, they held the first ever meeting to discuss women's rights in Seneca Falls. So that's kind of a pretty famous moment in women's rights. Two other important figures during this time who played a role in this convention were Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass. Very sad. At least there's a little humor. You'll always know I'll mispronounce something. So you can just laugh at me. I'm okay with that. I laugh at myself. So these are two African Americans. I think most of us know who those are. It's possible. So some sites say that there were no African American women in attendance. And that is a point that we're going to come across in this discussion as well. People, though, think that it's possible that Sojourner Truth actually was there, but she apparently was involved in the planning of this. And then Frederick Douglass, Black American, he was there, and that was definitely notated in documents. Okay, so the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement worked harmoniously together up until the end of the Civil War. Here we see that the women's rights movement they were basically placed on the back burner, as many lawmakers at the time believed the nation could only handle one type of reform at a time. Thus, the freedom of slaves and the voting rights of black men came to fruition first. The women's rights movement, mainly white women's movement, took offense to this, believing both things should either happen simultaneously or that, and this is their words, educated white women should be allowed to vote before black men. And so the white women, clearly there's some real racism here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a big backer of this thinking. And Frederick Douglass was on the other side, saying black men are dying and deserve to be fully free. And the debate in the women's rights movement basically became race versus gender at that point. Black women were unfortunately stuck in the middle because they embodied both of these causes. Abolitionist Frances Ellen Walker Harper spoke on this when she said, this is one of her quotes, "When it was a question of race, I let the lesser question of sex go. But the white women all go for sex, letting race occupy a lesser position."
Yeah.
Looking back onto history now, I thought about this. If you could choose only one area to advance, even though I really think that both things could have happened simultaneously, I do think,
should have.
yeah, I do think though that the lawmakers chose correctly, because in the end, the freedom of black men was essential to the freedom of black women and eventually all women. So it should have happened simultaneously, but I see that the true advantage there of the timing.
Because they were under direct oppression?
Yeah.
Is that why you, yeah.
Yeah, they were under direct oppression, and
I mean,
it also
in
impacted
the
black
moment.
women too.
In the moment.
Yeah. And so, like, black women would never have the right to vote if black men didn't receive the right to vote. Like, it should have all happened at once, right? But
Yeah, everyone should have been equal. That's ridiculous.
yeah. So it's just a hypothetical.
Just
Okay.
a power grab from
Yeah.
everyone's perspective.
Right. So, the women's suffrage movement itself suffered an internal rift. There were differences of opinions on how to proceed, and the group splintered into two rival groups. The American Women Suffrage Association was led by a white woman, Lucy Stone, and a black woman, Frances Ellen Walker Harper, who we just heard a quote of hers. This group believed the best approach forward was petitioning state governments for action on women's suffrage. The National Women's Suffrage Association was the second group. It was led by two white women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They believed the best approach was straight to the federal government, hoping for the next amendment, the 16th, to be for women's suffrage. So there were other amendments in the time, so it kind of gives you an idea of the time frame here. This rivalry between the groups was bitter and would not be resolved until roughly 1890, when the two groups merged into one called the National American Women Suffrage Association, NAWSA. NALSA, I guess. Okay. We see then another divide arise over race. Black women suffragists are pushed aside, and even Frederick Douglass is barred from attending meetings. Jim Crow laws in the South allowed white women to bar black women from joining their suffrage chapters and meetings. In what became known as the, quote, Southern strategy, white Southern women argued that by granting white women the right to vote, they could drown out the votes of black men. I think that's just shocking, right?
Wow.
Talk about throwing people under the bus. Also,
Good
during this
Lord.
time, lynchings of black people, especially black men, were rampant, and we have the rise of the horrible terror group, the KKK. Despite having federal voting rights, black men were barred by local discrimination and violence from exercising this right. And so that's just a paragraph basically about that story from 1920, but this is obviously much before that time. Nevertheless,
That's so gross.
Yeah.
Sorry, that quote's disgusting.
yeah. Kara, do you want to talk? Do you want to do some of this? Do you kind of know where we're
I
at
can.
in the notes?
Yeah, I'm following along.
Do you want to start from the paragraph nevertheless?
Sure.
Okay.
Nevertheless, black women persisted and formed their own suffrage associations. In 1896, they formed the National Association of Colored Women in Washington, D.C. Members of these associations tended to focus on human rights and universal suffrage. Several prominent women black leaders, speakers, and writers during this time were Mary Church Tyrrell, I.W. Wells, Adela Hunt Logan, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Legenia Burns Hope. Their activism is heroic and breathtaking, especially given the odds stacked against them and how long the struggle would last for them. Another organization ended up joining the fight for women's suffrage, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was predominantly white, but did have black members. One of their main objectives at the time outside of women's suffrage was the prohibition of alcohol. When the WCTU joined the fight for women's suffrage, the alcohol industry also joined the fight to stop women from ever voting. The resistance to women's suffrage at times was ugly. Textiles and railroad owners also opposed women's suffrage because they feared women would want better and safer labor laws and would cost them more money. And then we have women. There were other women who were anti-suffragettes. They feared that if the women got the right to vote, it would destroy the family unit, increased socialist, quote-unquote, voters in America. They said women couldn't possibly be involved in politics and also raise children. Wow.
Yeah, I liken that to like saying people can't chew gum and walk at the same time.
It's kind of shocking.
Yeah.
But I mean, we see that today. People have just such widely
we're going to see
views on
this. We have some stuff at the end of this episode that you're going to see some of this stuff come back. So, yeah. Do you want to keep going?
Sure. These groups would go on to run ads in newspapers and mailing postcards declaring women who wanted the right to vote as loud, abusive, ugly, and abrasive. They were lesbians and women who would become men, women so ugly no one would want to marry them. They were terrible mothers and wives and even monsters. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were several states that began to grant women the right to vote on their own. Wyoming became the first state in 1893, and Utah, Colorado, and Idaho soon followed. By the time the 19th Amendment was being debated in Congress, some 21 states would have already allowed women the right to vote. But in the South, Southwest, and part of the North, there were holdouts. We'll return to this at the very end of our history exploration. You take over?
Yeah. Between 1896 to 1909, over 160 legislative measures were proposed, but 0 passed. This is all about women's suffrage. So far, nothing had moved the needle for lasting change. Susan B. Anthony called this timeframe the doldrums, given no tangible progress had been made. After this timeframe, there is a new generation of women who join this fight, and a new social movement rises up called the New Woman Movement. It encourages women to be in public spaces. This movement encouraged women to become educated and enter the public square. Apparently, riding bicycles was a taboo thing for women, so they started to do that too. I thought that was kind of interesting. Several women from this new generation were Alice Paul, who we talked about in episode 3, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Harriet Stanton Blatch. When Alice Paul joined the National American Women Suffrage Association, NALSA, I don't think they call it that, but it's kind of fun. When Alice joined, she revived the push to focus on federal change by way of a constitutional amendment. She also wanted to take a more hardline approach on how to achieve this. The association unfortunately threw her out for this. This caused yet another split. Alice Paul, along with Lucy Burns, formed the National Women's Party in 1916, which would be more vocal and more confrontational in their approach. This new group staged a protest called the Silent Sentinels, who had a group protest just outside the White House, and it lasted from 1917 to 1919. Some described it as a vigil. And I think it's honestly pretty tame. You know, they stood out there with signs, and like it made people very angry, though, that they did this. I'll talk about that in a second. Eventually, the tide began to shift for all these factions and organizations. Part of this shift occurred because of the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson was forced out of his isolationist policies, sending American troops to war to fight in that war. And leaders of the women's suffrage movement saw this as an opportunity to prove women's value. The leaders of the suffrage associations encouraged women to step into roles and jobs normally held by men. Men were at war in Europe, so who was going to make the weapons? Who would make the ammunition? Who would continue to produce the products that Americans needed? Women. And women rose to the occasion in droves. They worked in oil refineries, steel mills. They were nurses and seamstresses for the war effort as well. Women kept the country afloat during wartime. Nevertheless, because of the rival factions in the suffrage movement, some women refused to support the country during wartime. Alice Paul continued her protest, saying, "Why should women help a country that doesn't allow them to vote?" This was seen as unpatriotic. And some of the members of the National Women's Party, including Alice Paul, were arrested and beaten while in jail.
Wow.
When Woodrow Wilson learned of their imprisonment, he was disgusted and demanded they be released. Most likely both of these efforts by women suffragists, supporting the country through work and being in industry and doing all of those amazing jobs and things, and also the women who were arrested for protesting and then beaten in prison, these both things finally changed President Woodrow Wilson's mind that women should be granted the right to vote. And I found that really interesting. So you have these two factions who are at odds with each other, but in the end, both of their actions actually were the catalyst for change. So they both were effective. Well, I find that really interesting. Okay. So despite Wilson's support, Southern Democratic senators refused to pass the amendment. So frustrating. Even though it had passed the House of Representatives. However, thankfully, the next midterm elections, more Republicans joined the House and Senate, and the legislation finally passed the Senate on June 4th, 1919. But now what has to happen with all new amendments, three-fourths of the states, three-fourths of the states have to ratify that amendment. And it really came down to the wire here because the South continued to oppose it. And so by June of 1920, 35 states had ratified the amendment, and it was going to take 36. It was going to take 36. And the only two states that were left basically were North Carolina and Tennessee. And so they're in the South. And so Woodrow Wilson calls the governor of Tennessee and tries to pressure him, like, you need to make this happen. And thankfully, and it barely passed in their state, but thankfully it did pass on August 18th, 1920. And finally, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, became the law of the land. However, I wanted to point out yet again that the battle for suffrage for everybody, including black women and really black men, was still long from over. Even though you have some the federal legislation is clear. It should happen. But,
It's sad that it took pressure.
I know.
To, do something so obviously,
right.
Just for equality.
Right.
Just human beings.
Yeah. Let's see. I also wanted to point out, so in this story, you'll notice that the people pushing for this were Republicans. But in episode 3, we talk about how a shift in the party occurred, where they're basically flipped now. So the Democratic Party is the party that pushes for women's rights, that pushes for civil rights, that pushes for LGBTQ rights. That's about protecting people. That is pro-union party. And now the Republican Party is not that. So it's that if you want to learn more about that history and maybe why it happened, that's episode 3, Politics and Women, or Women in Politics. I can't remember the order we selected.
Or political women.
Political women.
Womanly political.
Womanly political. Okay, so that's the story of how women got the right to vote in the United States. What we're going to do now, let's see, I want to make sure, we already talked about that. Okay, so this brings our discussion to our present day.
Didn't want to leave anything interesting out.
Kara could go back to snoozing. I could continue talking about history. No, Kara, you were involved.
Look, this is interesting.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
I'll say it again. And when I read it, I was interested in it.
I just need to read more then.
It's the delivery.
Oh, I'll work on my delivery. I'll make it more exciting.
1896.
In 1896.
Yeah.
I just eat it up. I'm like, ooh, what happened in
I know you do.
1896?
Like,
Tell me.
That's interesting.
Okay. All right. So what I want to do now in the discussion, what we plan to do was move into our present time.
Slice of bread and eat it up.
Yum. Sliced bread with some butter. Okay.
So we're going into celebrations?
No, not yet. We're going into some really crazy stuff from today. Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about the party that is speaking disparagingly about women and women's rights, the Republican Party. And basically the right-wing people kind of on that right-wing thought, I guess. There is a push in conservative circles to bring us back to when women were second-class citizens, where women stayed at home, minded domestic issues, not political or corporate or anything near leadership capacity. Obviously, not every Republican holds these views. I want to say that at the front. So that's not
Yeah.
representative of everybody, but there's a chunk of right wing political world that is it's a little disturbing. So,
Yeah.
and you have to also think the catchphrase "Make America Great Again." When do they think America was great? What time was that? And why do they want to bring us back to then? And who was it great for? Or whom was it
I
great? You
often
know?
wonder if many of the people quoting that language even know what that means. Mm-hmm. Did they hold a certain view of what that actually means? Or do they actually know what went on in these times? But again, it's like, what are they actually talking about?
Right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel like...
And was it great?
Right. I mean, I sometimes believe that some people who vote for Trump don't fully understand the policies that he's pushing or the ramifications. Or even what policies at all. Like, anything. I don't know.
Like, does he have any?
Like, they're just not educating themselves, unfortunately, to really look deeply at these things, to understand what he's saying, and to take him at his word when he says it. You know, he means that. That's what he means.
Yeah.
And to not excuse it. And anyway. Okay, so...
Or does he even know what he's talking about?
That's also a good question. All right, I wanted to take a moment. We're going to talk about far-right people. We're going to talk about Christian nationalists, and we're going to talk about some maybe not as far-right people, politicians who would like to repeal the 19th Amendment so women will not be allowed to vote. So there are actually people in the right-wing sphere that want the 19th Amendment to be repealed, which to me is absolutely mind-blowing. That
That's pretty shocking.
This is the thing. Okay. Back in 2016, the hashtag Repeal the 19th ended up going viral in response to statistician and writer Nate Silver of 538 saying if only women voted in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton would win by an electoral count of 558 to 80.
458.
458. Did I say 550?
Yeah.
458. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
458 to Trump only getting 80. And if only men voted, Trump would win by a count of 350 to 188. And so at this...
I guess we see why they don't want women
yeah,
to vote.
Exactly. This is why they don't want women to vote. And basically, so what that says is if you don't like people's choices, some people would like to abolish the rights of others. Right? We saw that in... That was the argument, the Southern strategy argument of white women saying, if you give us the right to vote, we'll cancel out the black men's vote. It's basically the same thing.
What was it called?
Yeah.
Southern. What was that? What was it called?
The Southern strategy.
Strategy.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Let's see. The other thing is I don't love giving, because I'm going to attempt to play videos of these people saying these things. And the reason I want to do it is because I want you to, one, it shows it's real. Two, it really brings it home that these people really think that. And
They really exist.
yeah, and that it really exists. And I don't like, however, I don't like giving them airtime because I completely 100% disagree with them. But I feel like I'm doing it for more of a informational, educational experience for us and the listeners. All right, so we're going to start off with two Christian nationalists. And basically, I wanted to try to look this up so I could give a good definition for this. It's someone who believes that America has been and should always remain a Christian nation, that steps should be taken to ensure Christianity and Christians are given a privileged place in the country where others are second-class citizens. There's a quote that I've seen going around on social media that I feel like kind of captures this, but some people say Sinclair Lewis said it, but I don't think that he did. And so it's a little ambiguous of who said this, but the quote is, fascism will come to America draped in a flag and carrying a cross. So I've always believed that when you pair government and religion, it's trouble. Like trouble will happen. And we kind of saw that when we discussed Napoleon in our French Me Too movement episode. Napoleon made a pact with the Catholic Church to be able. He knew that there was power that way. History says that he was not religious. He was skeptical of all of it, but he knew that he could use it as a way of controlling people. Unfortunately, And Christian nationalists, like, they're not skeptical. I think they're actually legitimately, they believe everything, right? But they believe that they should dominate everything. And there's a bunch of different Christian nationalist movements. There's like the Seven Mountain something or other, which is like Christians should be in every area of society so that they can control everything, basically. And I always find it interesting because like certain elements of the Bible, how the kingdom of God is within you. You know, love your enemies. Do good to those who despitefully use you. Love your neighbor. Like it counters all of that, you know, but they don't want to accept that. So, okay. All right. So those are Christian nationalists. The first Christian nationalist, and this guy is super controversial. I believe he's based in Idaho, and they're basically trying to overtake a town. They have their own school system. It's nuts. And there's a bunch of sexual abuse allegations against women coming from this church. Not surprised. So this guy's name is Doug Wilson. And all right, I'm going to attempt to share. And I'm only going to play part of it. It's like a little nauseating to listen to. So, okay. Share. All right, Kara, do you see this?
Yep.
All right. If you can't hear it, just say something. Okay, I'm going to start.
So let us talk about women voting, shall we? Back in the bad old days, before the 19th Amendment, the men were considered to be the heads of their households and represented their families at the ballot box. So what happened when their wives were granted suffrage? Let us take a typical presidential election to illustrate it, using the first one in 1920 after women's suffrage was accomplished, the election between Warren Harding and James Cox. If both the husband and wife vote for Harding, say, then what you have done is simply multiply the number of total votes cast for him by 2. And if the husband votes for Harding, say, and the wife votes for Cox, then what you've done is cancel out the voice of that particular household. Upon discovering how they were each going to vote, what would be the harm if the two of them just stayed home for a quiet dinner together in order to cancel out one another's vote that way? Where was the great progress supposed to be located? The net effect of women's suffrage was not an advance in women's rights, but rather part of a push to replace covenanted entities like families with raw individualism. An overweening state greatly prefers governing an atomistic populace, where each individual is like a BB thrown into an electoral sack. There's no structural rigidity to it, especially after laxity in the law concerning porn, pot, and poker has now greased all the BBs. Nothing coheres anymore. In the older system, the people were grouped in molecules, Burke's little platoons, some of them quite complex, and molecular societies are much more capable of resisting the demands of statism. So the suffrage movement was actually not taking up the cause of women, but rather was part of a long-sustained war on the family.
Okay.
Wow. Ridiculous.
I know, it is. It's so interesting. And wow. It's just like, okay. Wow. Also, he doesn't, it appears that women can only be in households, in his opinion. Right? Every woman should be married.
But he's also saying they're canceling each other out. That's not to say that every woman is going to disagree with her husband.
Right. Exactly. But the woman who does, she should not be allowed to vote.
Right.
Because she's going to cancel out her husband's vote.
This is like generalizations made over and over and over and over.
Yeah, I can't remember the other point I was going to make. Yeah, it's just, oh, I was going to say, what about single women? What about widowed women? They don't get a vote either.
I know.
In his world. What about, like young women who haven't married yet?
Or choose not to marry.
What about lesbians? We know what he thinks about lesbians, but whatever. Oh, man. Okay.
It's true.
So
he's forgetting a big chunk of society.
Listen to his terminology, because there's another Christian nationalist who's going to borrow some of his terminology where he talks about molecules and blah, blah, blah stuff that doesn't make any sense. And it also reminds me of that moment in Music Man where they're all like, if we bring in music, if we have pool, it's going to spell trouble. Like, this is it. This is a slippery slope. You know that scene? It reminds me of that. Like, you let women vote.
I've never seen it.
Now we have rampant porn, and now we have chaos. Chaos. There aren't families anymore. All of them are exploded. Yeah, it's crazy. All right. Okay, so we're going to our next guy. His name is Joel Webbin. All right, let me select this tab. Here we go. I hope I don't hit any YouTube ads. We'll find out.
Me too.
All right, do you see this, Kara?
Yeah.
Do you think I should maximize it or just leave it where it's at?
Whatever. Maximize it if you can, maybe.
Okay. All right, here we go.
The reason why I have grown to despise democracy is because it's not we the people. It's we the some people. And who are those people? Non-elected officials. Like what democracy, what it lends its strength to is instead of having elected officials that have power, is a raw universal, because that's what we have is a universal democracy. Everyone is allowed to vote.
Right.
Everyone. And just for the record, yeah, I think the 19th Amendment should be repealed. I think that because, well, first and foremost, because I'm a Christian.
Wow.
And that is the position.
Oh.
Oh my gosh, you're saying that? Yes, that is the Christian position, is that households should not be divided against one another. So it's not just elevating a male vote, but it's elevating the household vote. We're saying that that society, if you break it down to the basic building block, is not atomistic as individuals, but molecular, being households. That the way that God sees humanity is He breaks them down to families, and so.
Okay, I can't take it anymore. All right, so
Isn't there a scripture that talks about Christ will turn father against? It basically talks about turning family members against each other
right, yeah, that's in
for
there.
the sake of the faith.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah, I mean, I
talking about?
wanted to keep going because he gets to that molecular thing. Like it's the same terminology. I also find it interesting that he clearly thinks he's very intelligent because he ends up going into that weird God. God says, "Whoa!" It's how he says the word God. Everything else is normal, and then God. Yeah, he's speaking for God. Yes.
I found it, but I don't know exactly what it says. Because of me, a son will turn against his father, a daughter her mother, and against her mother-in-law. Within your own families you will find enemies. Whoever loves father or mother or son or daughter more than me is not fit to be my disciple. Okay, that's the one I was thinking of.
That would take a long time for us to figure out how to interpret that.
Well, the context behind it.
That all families
Right.
should agree with each other, basically.
Yeah.
And that's saying that's not going to be the
But
case.
that's coming out of the Bible, so clearly that's does not support his view.
Right. Okay. There was something else I wanted to say about him. He not only wants to repeal the 19th Amendment, he also wants to not be a democracy anymore. And I think that's really at the heart of Christian nationalism. What they really want is to impose their beliefs on everybody else, and they want to create an authoritarian theocracy, basically.
But the men get the vote,
And that's what they want. They're going to impose that on people.
which is ridiculous though, because again we're talking about like what about single mothers?
I know.
What about
They don't care.
widower?
They don't
widows?
care.
What about
They don't care.
people who choose not to marry? It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So, not surprised. All right. We're going to move out of the Christian nationalist sphere. Now we're going to give examples of women not voting with their husbands or not telling their husbands who they're really voting for, and how that's created a big stir right now. So what I'm going to do is there's the video that created the stir. It was Julia Roberts did a voiceover of this video where I'm going to show a little bit of this. So I'm taking this from MSNBC host Nicole Wallace's show. Is that right? No, I'm sorry. I skipped some stuff. We'll do that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll do it right now. I just talked about it. So let me pull that up.
No.
It would be here. Yes. Okay, so we'll do this first. It was out of order for me, but I'll do it anyway. All right, so we're going to share. Sorry, this always takes me a little extra time. This. Okay. Let me expand this. So I have this timed out. I'm going to stop this at certain spots and we'll talk about it. All right, so I'm supposed to start it from the beginning.
The one place in America where women still have a right to choose. You can vote any way you want. And no one will ever know.
Did you make the right choice?
Sure did, honey.
Remember, what happens in the booth stays in the booth. Vote Harris Walz.
That was Oscar-winning actress Julia Roberts in a new ad boosting one of the closing messages of the Harris campaign. that your MAGA supporting husband doesn't have to know if you decide not to vote for the guy bragging about overturning Roe versus Wade and grabbing women by the P word. That message, though, is freaking out the right, especially its smallest, most fragile men. They're having complete and utter meltdowns on their podcasts and TV shows. Here's Trump ally Charlie Kirk.
She needs people to basically lie to their husbands, which they are promoting, by the way. It is the embodiment of the downfall of the American family. I think it's so gross. I think it's so just nauseating where this wife is wearing you'll show it, wearing the American hat. She's coming in with her sweet husband who probably works his tail off to make sure that she can go, and have a nice life and provides for the family. She lies to him saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump. And then she votes for Kamala Harris as her little secret in the voting booth.
Okay, so that's the first clip from this.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just bizarre to me. It's really bizarre. And okay, so then there's this one.
I actually have to go in a sec to go teach.
Okay, I will solo finish this out then.
I'm bummed, but I do have to go.
Okay. All right. Sorry, you're stuck with me,
But
everybody.
I'll stick here for the clip.
Okay. All right. Next clip.
Going into the voting.
Let me see who this is. This guy's name is Jesse Waters, and he is a commentator on Fox News.
And pulling the lever for Harris, that's the same thing as having an affair. That violates the sanctity of our marriage.
Yes.
What else is she keeping from me?
Exactly.
What else has she been lying about?
Why would she lie to you?
Wow.
Have you threatened her? Why would she lie to you?
Oh, they want me to tease.
Why would she do that and then vote Harris? Why would she say she was voting Trump and then voting Harris? And I caught her, and then she said, I lied to you for the last 4 years.
You intimidate.
It's over, Emma.
Okay, so there we go. That's our the other clip. Kara, there's just going to be an empty screen. Oh no. Okay, well, here we go. Nothing. So everybody, you're just gonna see an empty chair. Just imagine Kara is there. Kara's leaving. She has to go teach. We tried to get to this sooner, but we were having some technical issues. So here we are. All right. Thank you for staying with me. I appreciate you. Heart. Okay. We're moving on now to Republican politicians or who have some association with a politician. The first person is John McEntee. He was a former Trump administration official. And I'm going to share a really quick, he thinks it's a joke, but it's not. And a lot of his stuff is like this on TikTok, on his social media feed. Okay, let me go to share that. Okay, here we go. It's very short, so it's not going to take very long.
So I guess
10
we
seconds.
misunderstood. When we said we wanted male-only voting, we meant male M-A-L-E.
All right, lovely dude. So lovely. And this guy worked in the first Trump administration, so that was awesome. So that's why we're getting here. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen. Sorry about this. Okay. All right, now we're going to move on to a little session between Ann Coulter and this guy named Ben McInnes. All right. Go to my screen again. It's not wanting to do it. Okay, take this off. There we go. I was having a little technical issue. Okay, so this is Ann Coulter. Okay. All right, expand my screen. Here we go.
Than Reagan did against Carter in 1980.
Really? Well, the other big problem with that was women voters. Women should have the right to vote, but should they vote?
Well, as you know, my position is women should not have the right to vote.
Good.
It's very popular on college campuses.
Yeah, I mean, we'll lose the odd "and" as collateral damage, but
No, we can still write books. We can run for office.
Okay, so that's the little clip. The video stopped working, but the sound was there at least. Okay. All right, so those are the examples. We did that one. So basically, I wanted to highlight that just because that shows you that these ideas are still in our culture. The ideas of sexism, the ideas of women don't know what they're doing, women are uneducated, women can't be trusted, all of these things, all of these, the things related to sexism, those things are still very much present in our society. So much so that people who are trying to hold office, whether it's local office like you see in Idaho, or if it's this, the whole presidential, the whole enchilada, they want to control things and they want to force their own beliefs onto other people versus just letting people be free, just letting people live. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for putting up with me. Again, you're going to be stuck with me. I'm so sorry. I will give you my very best. Okay, so this part of the episode is a Celebrate Women. I'm not going to put on my party hat. I'm just going to ring my Liberty Bell. Okay, we are going to celebrate women together. I ended up selecting 2 women from the past and then 1 woman from the present. The first woman we've already heard about is Susan B. Anthony. And my sourcing for this I took from the National Women's History Museum in an article written by Marissa Matthias. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15th, 1820 in Massachusetts. She was raised a Quaker, and her belief in equality inspired and guided her throughout her life's work. Anthony fought for the abolition of slavery. In 1856, she served as an American Anti-Slavery Society agent, making speeches, organizing meetings, and distributing pamphlets. In 1851, Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the 2 suffragettes worked to gain independence and equality for women for the rest of their lives. She traveled around the country advocating for women's rights and lobbied Congress every year until her death. She died March 13th, 1906, 14 years before many women were given the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. I thought that was rather sad that she didn't live to see it. Also, weirdly, she died on my birthday, March 13th. Odd little fact. Okay, I wanted to highlight this story. This is not actually something I knew about, and I feel like you would, probably several of you know this already, but again, I'm learning things for the first time. So this is a quick story. I'll just read it. It's just a few paragraphs. In 1872, after the Civil War, suffragists had 4 major legal strategies: campaigning at the federal and state level, lobbying to support voters in their casting of ballots, proposing a new women's suffrage constitutional amendment, and litigating in court to test women's rights under the existing 14th and 15th Amendments. Susan B. Anthony preached militancy to women throughout the presidential campaign of 1872, urging them to claim their rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments by registering to vote in every state of the Union. During the campaign, Anthony, her sisters, and a close Quaker friend walked to a nearby barbershop to register to vote, and 11 other women joined them. The women boldly entered, and the bewildered male registers allowed them to sign in. Then, on the morning of November 5th, she cast her first ballot, and only presidential ballot, for the Republican candidate Ulysses Grant and 2 congressmen. Weeks later, on November 18th, she was arrested at her home in Rochester, New York, by a U.S. Marshal and put on trial at the Ontario County Courthouse. She and her colleagues all pleaded not guilty, and their bail was set. For 3 weeks, she traveled around the country, delivering lectures on the crime of a citizen voting in an election. The prosecutor complained, and the trial was moved to another county. On June 17th, 1873, Anthony was tried by 12 white men in the jury box, but the judge made his decision before even hearing the trial. The judge directed the jury that their verdict declared her guilty. Anthony, forbidden to defend herself until after the verdict, was convicted and fined $100, which she refused to pay. The judge purposely did not sentence her to prison time, which ended her opportunity to appeal her case. Anthony was hoping an appeal could make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Although her plan did not materialize, the trial made national headlines and expanded discussion of the movement. I thought that was really interesting. I really had never known that she voted, was arrested, went through this whole process, and her whole plan was to try to get this to go to the Supreme Court. I thought that was really fascinating. All right, lastly on Susan B. Anthony, I wanted to highlight a couple of her own quotes. This is the first one, end quote. "It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union. And we formed it, not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot." And she said that in 1873. And the last quote is, "There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make the laws and elect the lawmakers." So that's a little bit about Susan B. Anthony. And then the second woman we're going to celebrate from the past is Frances Ellen Walker Harper. And we already quoted her and talked a little bit about her in the previous section. And again, my source is also from the National Women's History Museum. And this article is written by Carrie Lee Alexander. It begins, "As a poet, author, and lecturer, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a household name in the 19th century. Not only was she the first African-American woman to publish a short story, but she was also an influential abolitionist, suffragist, and reformer that co-founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs." Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born on September 24th, 1825 in Baltimore, Maryland. An only child, Harper was born to free African-American parents. Unfortunately, by the time she was 3 years old, both of her parents had died and she became an orphan. Wow. Harper's aunt and uncle, Henrietta and William Watkins, raised her after her parents' death. Her uncle was an outspoken abolitionist, practiced self-taught medicine, organized a black literary society, and established his own school in 1820 called the Watkins Academy for Negro Youth. Frances Harper learned from her husband's activism, and she attended the Watkins Academy until she was 13 years old. I have this bad feeling I said husband, I meant uncle. Her uncle's activism. At that age, children were typically expected to join the workforce. Harper took a job as a nursemaid and seamstress for a white family that owned a bookshop. Her love for books blossomed as she spent any free time she had in the shop. By age 21, Harper wrote her first small volume of poetry called Forest Leaves. When she was 26 years old, Harper left Maryland and became the first woman instructor at Union Seminary, a school for free African Americans in Wilberforce, Ohio. She taught domestic science for a year and then moved to a school in York, Pennsylvania. Shortly after she began working as a teacher, her home state of Maryland passed a law stating that free African Americans living in the North were no longer allowed to enter the state of Maryland. Wow. If found, they would be imprisoned and sold into slavery. Harper was now unable to return to her home. She decided to devote all of her efforts to the anti-slavery cause. Harper moved in with William and Letitia George Still, who were abolitionists and friends of her uncle. William Still became known as the father of the Underground Railroad, while he was an office clerk and janitor in the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Supported by the Stills, Harper began writing poetry for anti-slavery newspapers. Her poem, Eliza Harris, was published in The Liberator and in Frederick Douglass's paper. By the time Harper left Philadelphia in 1854, she had compiled her second small volume of poetry called Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, with an introduction by abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. For the next 8 years, Harper traveled across the United States and Canada as a lecturer. After her first speech entitled The Elevation and Education of Our People, she was hired as a traveling lecturer for various organizations. In addition to her anti-slavery lectures, Harper was committed to the struggle for women's rights and the temperance movement. She included her observations from her travels in her writings and began to publish novels, short stories, and poetry focused on the issues of racism, feminism, and classism. In 1859, Harper published a short story in the Anglo-African magazine called The Two Offers. This short story about women's education became the first short story published by an African-American woman. In November 22nd, 1860, Frances married Fenton Harper, and the couple had a daughter named Mary. Unfortunately, her husband died 4 years later. After her husband's death, Harper began touring again and formed alliances with prominent women's rights activists. In 1866, Harper spoke at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York. Her famous speech, entitled "We Are All Bound Up Together," urged her fellow attendees to include African American women in their right for suffrage. Excuse me. She emphasized that Black women were facing the double burden of racism and sexism at the same time. Therefore, the fight for women's suffrage must include suffrage for African Americans. The next day, the convention held a meeting to organize the American Equal Rights Association to work for suffrage for both African Americans and women. However, the organization soon split over the decision to support the 15th Amendment, granting African American men the right to vote. Harper, along with Frederick Douglass and many others, supported the amendment and helped to form the American Women's Suffrage Association. Harper spent the rest of her career working for the pursuit of equal rights, job opportunities, and education for African American women. She was a co-founder and vice president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the director of the American Association of Colored Youth. She was a superintendent of the colored sections of the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania Women's Christian Temperance Unions. Frances Ella Watkins died February 22, 1911, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Super interesting life, extraordinary woman. Really honored that we had the chance to highlight her and learn about her. One of her quotes I wanted to read, outside of the one we already read. She said or wrote, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." I really love that quote. I've always thought about that when we think about slavery and racism and sexism, that because we are all bound up together, there is a curse and evil that is left on the people who are doing that binding up, who are the people who are doing on the suppression, I should say. She said it much better than I did. All right, moving on to the last woman we're going to celebrate from the present day. I saw this woman on MSNBC, and I was just really impressed with her speaking and her the organization that she has co-founded, and so I wanted to highlight her. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project, and her name is Tara Setmayer. She is a former CNN political commentator, contributed to ABC News, and former GOP communications director on Capitol Hill. Setmayer, I'm saying Setmayer, it could be Setmeyer. I should have looked this up. Kara's here, and she should tell me that I should have looked this up. If she were here, she'd say that. She currently serves as a University of Virginia Center for Politics resident scholar. In collaboration with the Center for Politics, she narrated the Emmy-nominated three-part documentary, Dismantling Democracy, which aired nationally on PBS stations and is currently streaming on Prime. Prior to joining the University of Virginia, she was named a Harvard Institute of Politics resident fellow in 2020. She regularly appears on MSNBC, on ABC's The View, and on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. And she's also a regular guest on Sirius XM's top-rated political show, The Michael Smerconish Program, on the POTUS channel. She has written for CNN, Bloomberg, The Daily Beast, Cosmopolitan, NBC. And this is also really interesting. After spending 27 years in political communications with the Republican Party, Setmayer publicly left the GOP in November 2020 after Donald Trump refused to concede the election to Joe Biden. And she is co-founder of the Seneca Project. She founded that with Michelle Kinney. And it's a group with a mission to galvanize women to save democracy. And another quote from that group's page, the Seneca Project: "It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. The assault on women's rights transcends party lines. The threat is imminent and ongoing." And you can find out more about that at thesenecaproject.us. And so thank you so much for sticking with me. I'm sorry that Kara left. This is how the episode went, but really appreciate your time. And if you're listening to this when it releases on Tuesday, it is election day. And if you have not voted, please vote. And of course, we're going to advocate that you vote for the Harris Walz ticket and you vote blue, because of all the things we discussed today. So thank you so much. Take care. I'll see you again next week.